Today we're going to begin discussing the Vietnam War, which was one of the most famous wars in American history in the 20th century. It was one of the most hated wars that our country has ever been in as far as how the American people responded to it, which was a direct contrast to how people responded to World War II. In your book, if you look at starting on page 60 in the Cold War book and going up to page 68, I believe, actually page 71, you can see in your book the discussion about the Vietnam War. And it starts on page 60. You can see a map, and it's important for you to recognize the location of the country. On the map, you can see that it's on the southern border of China, and you can see where the dividing line was in 1954. It was at the 17th parallel. It's important to memorize that division line, just like in Korea, it was the 38th parallel. There was a lot of reasons why we became involved in Vietnam, but the number one reason was the prevention of the spread of communism, just for the same reason that we entered other conflicts such as Korea. If you look on the screen here, you can see the main topics that we'll be discussing with the Vietnam War. Basically, the struggle for Southeast Asia after the Korean War ended, which succeeded in us containing communism in the fact that the North did not take over the South, the Chinese becoming communist in 1949, and of course the Soviet Union. It was seen that Southeast Asia would be the next location of the advance of communism, so we wanted to prevent that at all costs. We'll be looking at the context of the Cold War in both Vietnam and Laos, which is a country that borders Vietnam, if you see on your map on page 60. Obviously, we'll be considering the American involvement because we were the main ones that escalated the conflict and kept it going for so many years. You can see at the top here that I'm putting the years 1964 to 1970s because those were the main years that the Vietnam War was in full swing. The actual beginnings of the Vietnam conflict can actually be traced back to the early 1950s when the French were expelled from Vietnam by a local independence movement. And the last American troops didn't leave the country until 1975, which was then followed by the North taking over the entire country and uniting it under a communist regime. Johnson, who became president after Kennedy's assassination, definitely heightened the conflict in the years of 1965 to 1967. This was met with a storm of protests back home. There was a key event in 1968 called the Tet Offensive, which really showed the failures that American soldiers were experiencing at the hand of these North Vietnamese soldiers, who we called the Viet Cong. They were the guerrilla fighters of the North Vietnamese army. Finally, Nixon becomes president in 1968 and begins the removal of American forces from the country of Vietnam. So those are the main points that we'll be discussing in the Vietnam War. Let's look at why Southeast Asia became such an important point to focus on in the process of the Cold War. Like we said, Lyndon Johnson, the new president of the United States after the Kennedy assassination, the Vietnam War to him at first was one of his lowest priorities. He had a much more domestic challenge at hand to try to be successful with. He called his domestic program the Great Society, and it included areas such as civil rights laws, a war on poverty, issues involving education fairness, even things such as the environment and transportation were focused on here domestically. So really at first, Johnson was more concerned in achieving success in those areas as opposed to escalating the Vietnam War. Similarly, there was a new leader in the Soviet Union after Khrushchev was pretty much forced to resign in 1964 following the Cuban Missile Crisis. This new leader was named Leonid Brezhnev, and he was more focused with consolidating power and building his nation's strength. So with him being focused on that, again, the Vietnam War and the struggle in Southeast Asia was a lesser priority. Yet in Southeast Asia itself, it was the ending years of World War II which saw a series of indigenous revolts against former colonial powers. The Japanese had occupied much of Southeast Asia during the years of World War II, but before that time, many colonial powers such as the French had been involved and had taken portions of Southeast Asia as part of their empire. Some of these movements took place in locations such as the Philippines, which the Americans had occupied ever since the Spanish-American War of 1898, also Malaysia, and then Indochina, which is what we call Southeast Asia, and includes the countries of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand. However, French Indochina was a unique case. This is the area of Southeast Asia which includes the countries that I just mentioned, and they had been occupied by the French for quite some time. The reason why this particular location was a unique case was because they shared a border with China, and these countries lacked effective governmental resistance, and that foreshadowed very different results than what had taken place in the Philippines and in Malaysia, who easily got their independence after World War II. France had ruled Indochina since the 19th century, but had failed to suppress the region's ancient cultures. So, therefore, demands for liberation had been spoken out as early as the time of World War I. There was a leader by the name of Ho Chi Minh, which is basically what he was renamed. His original name was Nguyen Tat Thanh, and Ho Chi Minh means he who brings enlightenment. And this was a young man who actually had traveled to Europe in the years of things like the Versailles Peace Conference and had spoken out for Indochinese independence. So you can see that this was a process that started long before the end of World War II. Ho Chi Minh was a former merchant seaman and an expert chef. At first, he was a quiet and preferred to be more of a resourceful person when it came to trying to lead his country to independence. He was a communist, and then 2 decades later, after he had traveled to Europe, he would be the one who would create a group of associates who would start a group called the Viet Minh, which stood for League for Vietnamese Independence. May of 1941 is when Ho Chi Minh created this group, the Viet Minh, the League for Vietnamese Independence. During World War II, the Viet Minh fought on the Allied side because they were fighting against Japanese occupation forces. However, they assumed that with the end of World War II and the surrender of the Japanese, that they would be given their independence, just like the Koreans felt the same thing. Many of those who joined in the units of the Viet Minh were actually non-communists, but they worked with the Viet Minh because it was the only effective agency aiming at liberation and independence after World War II. The Japanese were forced to surrender, as we know, in the end of World War II, but when it came to these Viet Minh fighters, the Japanese actually turned their weapons to the Viet Minh instead of the French, which had been expected that they should turn them over to the French, given that the French had colonial power over Vietnam. But that kind of fueled this idea that the Vietnamese could be independent, the fact that the Japanese surrendered to them. On September 2nd of 1945, Ho Chi Minh addressed a huge crowd of people in Hanoi, which is the capital of North Vietnam, and he proclaimed Vietnamese independence. His address actually modeled the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But the problem was this independence that he was promising was becoming very elusive because he anticipated that we would support his desire for his country to be independent. But because Truman, who became president at the ending months, I should say, of World War II, was a staunch anti-communist, and because the Viet Minh had communist elements, we did not give the support that Ho Chi Minh was expecting. Plus, we were trying to back France, who was trying to regain control over Indochina. Therefore, if the Americans weren't going to completely support the Viet Minh in achieving independence, the Viet Minh hoped that the French would then just make a deal rather than go into a long, costly colonial war. And Ho Chi Minh believed that if France was offered some economic concessions and preservation of French property in Indochina, that they might recognize Vietnamese independence. So therefore, there were 2 months of talks that saw the result of what you see on the screen here, the Ho Saint-Denis Accords, which were signed in March of 1946. And under this agreement, the French would recognize Vietnam as a free state with its own government, parliament, army, and finances. Vietnam would become part of an Indochinese Federation and the French Union. France would station 25,000 troops in the north until the end of 1952, and in return, the Viet Minh would end its guerrilla war in the south. But the problem was, this agreement was pretty much doomed to fall apart from its beginning. The only reason that France let this agreement be signed was to give them unopposed entry of French troops into the north so that France could eventually destroy Vietnamese independence. So this was pretty much a guise that the French used so that they could stall for time, basically, until they could have more strength to finally put down the independence movement that was going on here. By the fall of 1946, the inadequacy of these accords were shown. There were all kinds of incidents between the French troops and the Viet Minh, and people were dying, so this was clear that these peace accords were a false finally, after nearly a little over 8 years of fighting between the French forces and these Viet Minh fighters, a major victory was won by the Viet Minh. The French lost at a place called Dien Bien Phu. It's often referred to the fall of Dien Bien Phu in May 7th of 1954. And that was basically the clincher to Vietnam being able to expel the French from Indochina. The fighting throughout these 8 years, the Viet Minh proved themselves to be very capable of handling the French troops. When the Chinese won their communist victory in 1949, they were able to send aid to the Viet Minh, so definitely these fighters had the supplies that were needed, plus the motivation. They had a purpose and a passion for what they were doing. So the French are now gone from Indochina, so the question is, what kind of a government is going to emerge here in Vietnam? A couple of months after this major defeat for the French, the Geneva Accords were signed on July 20th of 1954. And in the process of signing these agreements, the Soviets were involved, the Chinese were involved, and basically what they decided was to divide Indochina into 4 different countries: North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. North Vietnam would be ruled by the Viet Minh, and South Vietnam would be a democracy led by a person named Ngo Dinh Diem, who was an anti-communist, similar to Syngman Rhee in South Korea. The 2 Vietnams would be divided at the 17th parallel, which was suggested by the Soviet ambassador to this convention, and elections would be held to reunify Vietnam under one government in 1956. Laos and Cambodia would become independent and neutral nations under coalition governments. So that was the agreement that was signed here in July of 1954. So the effort that Ho Chi Minh had led to unify Vietnam and make it independent had failed, but it wasn't over yet, because the Viet Minh had earned a lot of respect by liberating Vietnam from the French. And in the South, to overcome this, Ngo Dinh Diem would have to build a regime that could demonstrate that the country would be better in his hands, as opposed to Ho Chi Minh, who had been around for quite some time and working for the independence and freedom of the Vietnamese. Ngo Dinh Diem's credentials were pretty good, but he didn't appreciate any type of a need for social reforms to destroy what the French had done in their years of colonial rule. And even if he had, his government didn't have the support of the people, the police, or the army, and therefore was not really equipped to execute any type of reforms. So after Geneva Accords, Ho Chi Minh waited with optimism for these supposed elections that were supposed to be held in 1956, but he pretty much predicted that those would never be held. Diem had denounced the Geneva Accords, and so that right from the beginning, it was assumed that he would rely on the U.S. sponsorship to be able to control South Vietnam, and he also thought that these elections would not take place. He didn't want them to take place because he knew that he wouldn't win. So pretty much Diem's rule at this point can be divided into 3 different periods. The first stage, 1954 to 1955, in which he tried to manage against all expectations to maintain himself. Then from 1955 to 1957, during which his government created a pretty strong belief in its ability to take constructive action. And finally, 1957 to 1963, at which point the resentment against Diem among the people of South Vietnam began to grow dramatically, resulting in his final expulsion from power. One of the reasons why he didn't really work with his people, that he didn't click with them, is number one, he was a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, and his advisors and family were often very corrupt, and so it was something that wouldn't appeal to the people. He hated communism and colonialism, and the hatred of communism would earn him a lot of resentment, because that has what was effective in removing the French. So in 1957, the Soviets, after the elections did not take place, as was expected, put a proposal on the table for both of the Vietnams to be divided still and accepted into the UN. The U.S. rejects this, which was a pretty bad decision because it resulted then in a 20-year war almost. Ho Chi Minh, at that point, considered war. He formed the Viet Cong, which were the guerrilla units of the North Vietnamese Army, and also the NLF, or the National Liberation Front, to combat South Vietnamese forces. Laos, which was the country that borders Vietnam, was supposed to be neutral. However, a trail put in place by the Viet Cong went through a good portion of Laos, so therefore they were involved in the whole process of the war. So this neutrality that they were supposed to be guaranteed was false because they were used anyways throughout the entire Vietnam War. South Vietnam then was supported by the U.S., but with increased conflicts, it was devastating to us to keep control. Next, we'll see how the war escalates from here.